6.
Oh, okay, well then I shouldn't, I guess they can come around the other side. Okay. Gotta figure out how to handle a full house. Welcome back to those of you who were here last week to hear Philip's first talk on the Red Book of Carl Jung, and he's back to finish up his talk on the continuation of that theme. So welcome back to Philip.
Thank you.
Please turn off your phones.
Yes.
Or mute them.
How is the volume? I can't hear myself at all.
No,
So
no, he's not
something
hear
is.
you at all.
Is this off?
Go ahead.
Okay. How is the volume? Volume.
Wonderful.
Good. So first of all, if you get an invitation from me that says a special event, do not open it. I did that with somebody else, and I've got something weird going on in my Gmail, so I just want you to know that.
Or from me.
Or from Joe. That's right.
Is that still on?
Sorry?
I wondered if you need the lights still on.
No, if you could just turn them out. Thank you. Right. So we do the second presentation of Carl Jung's Red Book today. And you probably have had anxiety dreams. How many people have had them, right? Few people have not. So I had a dream last night, which was not a great cosmic dream. It was basically that I was in Center City, and I realized I was an hour away from Cathedral Village, and I might not get back in time for this class. And I lost my flash drive. So I'm glad to be here, back in the world of the possible. So we're talking about Jung's Red Book, which he called the Liber Novus, the new book, and it was written and drawn between 1914 and 1930. These are the years that he lived. He lived till 85. A Swiss psychiatrist. He was the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor and a psychic mother who was really apparently quite psychic. He was very, very close to Freud from 1907 to 1913. And during those 6 years, they developed a very intense relationship with, as I said last week, some really erotic overtones, maybe not necessarily genitally sexual, but the intense relationship was such that they wrote letters back and forth. Freud, being 20 years older, was a kind of father figure to Jung, and Jung had said that, but Jung was really quite ambivalent about it. Freud, with all of his disciples, I think with no exceptions, except perhaps his daughter and maybe just a few others, basically kind of killed off his young or his disciples. Freud was very adamant about his particular principles, and Jung was already fairly well established when he met Freud, but they had a falling out in 1913. But Jung said he always had an affection for Freud, even to the latter days. So we talk sometimes in Jungian language about synchronicity, which is a meaningful coincidence. And so in my mailbox, I got this from Johnny a couple days ago. It was actually in the Inquirer a day before my first class. And so this is Pearls Before Swine, and if you can read it, it says, I'm interested, it's a figurine manufacturing company. I'm interested in the job you're offering. What's it involve? I'm creating a line of famous psychologists and psychiatrists, and I need you to dye them, D-Y-E. How do you say this guy's name? Carl Jung? It's pronounced Jung, and oh, you should know one thing about the job. Since you'd be a novice, I'd have you dye some of the lesser known people and leave the more famous ones to be dyed by our experienced employees who are good at it. Only the good die young. The last frame, I have a Freudian urge to kill my cartoonist. So this is what Freud says, Jung rather says about these years when he was working on the Red Book. The years of which I have spoken to you when I pursued the inner images were the most important time of my life. Everything else is to be derived from this. It began at that time, and the later details hardly mattered anymore. My entire life consisted in elaborating what had burst forth from the unconscious and flooded me like an enigmatic stream and threatened to break me. That was the stuff of material for more than only one life. Everything later was merely the outer clarification, the scientific elaboration, and the integration into life. The numinous beginning, which contained everything, was then. Freud, I keep saying Freud, that must be a Jungian slip. From early days, Jung talked about having a personality number one and a personality number two. He thought his mother had this as well, that the personality one was rooted in ordinary reality, whereas personality two was able to really move into other dimensions, in many cases into figures from the past. When personality two entered, it felt as if a long dead yet perpetually present spirit had entered the room. This interplay ran throughout Jung's life. As he saw it, we are all like this. Part of us lives in the present, and the other connected to the centuries. In the Red Book, Jung is led by the spirit of the depths to waking visions with characters he dialogued with. And we know he fastidiously worked on this book and with his own artistic endeavors, and you can see here how he sketched things, and there's his color palette there, and working on this particular design. This we looked at last week, but I think it bears looking at again, which is the night journey. This is the night journey through the darkness, through the dangers, and with the monsters below. He did describe this whole period with the Red Book as often being frightening, disorienting, and we talked last week about his fear of going crazy and whether he was schizophrenic. And Jim had said he didn't think that schizophrenics could do the kind of elaborate, detailed artwork that Jung did. So who did he meet in these journeys through the Red Book? Various different characters that he considered spiritual guides. One of them was Philemon, who was a Gnostic pagan figure, as he called it. And Philemon was an archetype of the wise old man, the person who gave him wisdom beyond Jung's conscious knowing. There were other figures as well, Elijah and Salome. Now these are quite fanciful because they're not really the prophet Elijah. And Salome, you remember, was the one who danced before with John the Baptist, and John the Baptist head she asked for. But they become a kind of they morph into different kinds of figures. Salome represents the capacity for emotional feeling, whereas Elijah is the head type. And so there's great dialogue back and forth about how each of them complement each other and complement themselves in Jung as well. Here's Salome again. In Jung's visions, she's blind. Interestingly, feeling is blind. Jung said at some point that he felt the feeling function, the emotional capacity, was his least developed function, that he was a thinker, but his capacity for emotional feeling was he felt somewhat limited. You know, the more I read about Jung, the more I think, on the one hand, he's a fascinating individual and a genius, and also I think he would be a pain in the ass to live with. He was known, for example, for just flying all over the world, traveling all over the world while he had people waiting to come to be an analysis with him. And often, unless they were famous people like Hermann Hesse, in other words, he might just go off and leave all of these people. Apparently, there were a couple boarding houses in Zurich where people were kind of lined up to see him, but Jung was off doing his own thing. So he was a genius. He was an intense man, highly curious. Now, when we talk about synchronicity, that meaningful coincidence of things, I was going through the Red Book videos on YouTube and found this, which is my former Jungian analyst introducing my former professor and graduate advisor. So you will see, first of all, Beverly Zabriskie, who was my analyst, and then Ann Bedford Ulanoff from Union Seminary. And Anna's talking about how Jung perceived these figures in his visions as not symbols per se, but having some kind of actual psychic reality for him.
Pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague from New York, Ann Bedford Ulanoff. Ann has been a strong voice in Jungian studies for many decades. She holds the Christine Brooks Johnson Memorial Chair, established in memory of her student at New York's Union Theological Seminary, where she's a professor of psychiatry and religion. And she's also a Jungian analyst in private practice in Manhattan. Ann has many, many books to her credit, certainly 9 that I know of. And she is always at work. She's published many books of her own, and she published several with her husband, the late Barry Ulanoff. Her 2 recent titles are Spirit in Jung, The Unshuttered Heart, Opening to Aliveness and Deadness in the Self. So I'm so grateful that Ann is here with us today. Yes.
Thank you. In the Red Book, Jung encounters Elijah and Salome, who say to him, "We are real and not symbols." And they express the tone of the whole volume. What the guide Phillip conveys, psychic reality exists, it's there, it's objective, and addresses Jung in a series of images, figures, tasks. And though later, Jung reflects that these figures are personifications of unconscious thoughts, when he actually meets them, they are real experiences and evoke in him dread, loathing, confusion. He describes Salome as bloodthirsty horror, exclaiming, "I fear her." He understood Salome to personify his feeling, which he had scorned as grossly inferior to his thinking, personified by Elijah. And even later, when Salome is redeemed into loving and offers her love to Jung, he says to her, "You are like the serpent who coiled around me and pressed out my blood." And yet at the end of his encounters, he learns from Phillip that only through voluntary devotion to love do I arrive at my truest and innermost self. From this one of countless examples, we get a sense of what it is to read the Red Book. We plunge in, down, where encounters with the unconscious call us out, forcing us to tasks that if we avoid, we miss the boat. In painting 55, we see what Jung saw, that we all have a boat riding on the unconscious psyche, under which the serpent, the dragonfish, the monster of Fulfus swims, threatening to swallow the sun of consciousness. Jung was called to these encounters, forced by his own complexes that, when faced, yielded his vocation. He said, "In my 40th year of life, I had achieved everything that I had wished for myself." But he had lost his soul and had to go find it. With fright, he asks his soul, "Into what mist and darkness does your path lead? I limp after you on crutches of understanding. I follow, but it terrifies me." And yet Jung recognizes, quote, this life is the way, the long sought after way to the unfathomable divine, thus pairing psyche with soul, to whom he says, your meaning is a supreme meaning, and your steps are the steps of a god. Jung felt carried into fearsome territory beyond what Christ taught. The soul tells him, if you marry the ordered to the chaos, you produce the divine child, the supreme meaning beyond meaning and meaninglessness. Christ taught God is love, but you should know that love is also terrible. Christ overcomes the temptation of the devil, but not the temptation of God to good and reason. Identification, then, with what we call the good is not going to work anymore. For the soul tells him, nothing will deliver you from disorder and meaninglessness, since this is the other half of the world. In response, Jung says,
I'm going to stop it there.
Whoa.
So you get a feel from Anne's comments about Jung's encounters with the unconscious. You know, it's interesting with synchronicity. I recently was on a seminar with Anne. I hadn't seen her in years. And she said she was doing a paper on aging. Anne is in her 80s now. And she was going to use a stage in alchemy, which was something Jung got interested in after the Red Book, which is called the Negredo, which is the darkening, it's the difficult time, it's when you're going down into the pit. And I haven't read the paper yet, but she was using that as a metaphor for dealing with aging. And that was exactly the kind of alchemical image I had used in my paper, which had to do with the Negredo and the dark night of the soul in the mystic John of the Cross. So I thought, this is interesting. Make of that what you will. It had that kind of resonance to it. So what we're talking about in terms of Jung's journey is what he came to know as the individuation process, a process of becoming a psychological individual distinct from the general collective psychology, but not individualism. I think that's important to say, that to become ourselves more fully is not to isolate ourselves, but we're more capable of deeper interaction with each other as we also grow into our own uniqueness. This involves the integration of the conscious and the unconscious, and you see some of that in Jung's journey. And also recognizing and engaging what he called archetypes, these kind of primary repetitive patterns of behavior. We looked last week at the hero, we looked at Superman, Superwoman, and someone who will not be mentioned as a representative in some people's eyes of some kind of great hero. These motifs, these archetypes, we see them in movies, we see them in literature and ordinary life. Ones that he found particularly cogent in terms of making our way in the world and becoming more fully ourselves. One of them is the persona and the shadow dynamic. Now, the persona is not fake. As you may know, in Greek theater, it was a mask that also had a kind of megaphone to it. It had an extension to so the voice could be heard over the theater stage and into the audience. So the persona is not fake, but it don't want to just kind of let everything out all the time with everybody. There's a place for the persona. There's a place for roles if we have a particular profession. But Jung thought that the brighter the persona, the darker the shadow, meaning the more that we simply identify with a particular role, the more of our own psyche we're not able to come to terms with. And to give you a good example, my father who I dearly loved, but also experienced as intermittently quite rageful, would hold forth at the dinner table. And the role of the rest of the family was simply to sit there quietly and absorb it while he went on and he pontificated. And of course, when I experienced that, I thought, I will never do that. I will never do that. And here I am. This was during seminary, out to dinner with friends, and it was such a relief. I just told people what I thought. It was my turn. It was the voice of Yahweh. I just said, this is it. And I don't believe what you said. I believe this. I believe that. And afterward, a friend pulled me aside and said, what got into you? What got into you? Well, that's the shadow, right? The stuff that I internalized from my father and carried around. And it didn't fit my persona of a nice person. But having to recognize that and see that is part of our humanity that we otherwise project out into the world. And of course, we have an awful front row seat in this horrible theater of politics right now of the power of the shadow to be projected. They're liars, they're evil people, they're lowlifes, et cetera, et cetera. The capacity to project the shadow. This is what creates dictators, right? The anima animus is what he often called a contrasexual, which he thought was the feminine soul within the man and the masculine soul within the woman. And that this could be projected out so one would be madly in love with a woman in a way where one was not able to access one's own feminine dimensions and vice versa with women. Now, with our increased understanding of varieties of gender identities, this has come under question. And one might ask, so with a gay couple, is one the anima? Is one the animus? How does that work? And so I think the concept has had to be enlarged to understand that it isn't just literally male or female. For Jung, the female principle really was the principle of connection and relationship and nurture. And the male principle was that of objectivity, thinking, analysis. So you can see how, in a way, it's important to have both of these. And the anima animus is, I think it's a fluid concept, but it is definitely a central part of Jung's thinking. And then connecting to the self, and this is the capital S self, which is the archetype of wholeness, which is the sacred, the universal, what we might call the bigger self. Now, another woman who was very, very instrumental in my own growth was June Singer. June was a Jungian analyst who founded the Jung Center in Chicago. She and her husband, who was a rabbi, became early trainers in Zurich as Jungian analysts. She came back and she wrote a book that I highly recommend called Boundaries of the Soul, the Practice of Jung's Psychotherapy. When she wrote this, she became persona non grata with many of her Jungian colleagues who thought she was giving away trade secrets. Because in the book, she describes Jungian thought through the practice of psychotherapy, and she gives many case examples. But I think it's a very cogent book, and I recommend it if you wanted a kind of to go into Jung's thought more, but do it in a way where you can see ordinary people, you can see her interaction with them. When I came to see June, I was a very confused person in my late 30s. I had become ordained, I was in a parish, and I began to think, okay, part of this call may be authentic, but part of it may be reliving old family scripts. And I came to her with the question, whose life am I living? Whose life am I living? And so I had what's sometimes called a big dream, and you may have had these too, the dreams that you remember all of your life. And this was definitely an individuation big dream. So in the dream, I am in a large house, Victorian house, which is actually a music practice room. And if you've been a musician and you have gone through training, you may have been in a room or house dedicated to to practice, right? You go past rooms, you hear a trombone or maybe medieval music, you hear a singer, and there's all this cacophony. In this dream, I'm going upstairs, and there's a dim skylight at the top. I'm going up the stairs slowly, and at each room around this staircase, this is the view that I had going up. But in each room, I heard music. So it might be jazz, it might be Baroque music, it could be folk music. I heard all of these styles of music leaking under the door, and I listened and I thought, I like this music, but it's not my music. So I'd go to the next door, I'd listen again. I'd like this music, but it just didn't feel like it was mine. So finally, I get to the top of the stairs, and there is a door with the padlock on it, and there's a sign. Actually, I think it was etched in the wood that says, "Here lives someone who makes his own music." And Jung just smiled and said, "It's going to take you a long time to figure that dream out." And that's been part of my journey, and probably yours. Whose life am I living? Now, this is a favorite poet of mine, May Sarton. And I think this really catches the spirit of individuation. Now I become myself. Now I become myself. It's taken time, many years and places. I have been dissolved and shaken, worn other people's faces, run madly as if time were there, terribly old, crying a warning. Hurry, you will be dead before. What? Before you reach the morning? Where the end of the poem is clear? Or love safe in a walled city? Now to stand still, to be here, feel my own weight and density. The black shadow on the paper is my hand, the shadow of a word as thoughts shape the shaper falls heavy on the page is heard. All fuses now, falls into place, from wish to action, word to silence, my work, my love, my time, my face gathered into one intense gesture of growing like a plant, as slowly as the ripening fruit. Fertile, detached and always spent, falls but does not exhaust the root. So all the poem is, can give, grows in me to become the song, made so and rooted by love. Now there is time, and time is young. Oh, in this single hour I live, all of myself, and do not move. I, the pursued, who madly ran, stand still and stop the sun. Now I become myself. I have worn other people's faces. All fuses falls into place. The archetype of the self, which Jung talks about, a capital S self then, he says this in Memory, Dreams, and Reflections. The decisive question for man or woman, is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. Only if we know that the thing which truly matters is the infinite can we avoid fixing our interest upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals which are not of real importance. So here we see that the goal of individuation is to become ourselves, to not wear other people's faces, but it doesn't stop there because we are all related to some deeper matrix of being. And these are the kinds of things you see in the Red Book, the mandalas, which for Jung represented the self in the sense that there is a center to them. And this is, as you would say, a sacred center. Sometimes we see the cross and we see it in various forms. This one actually has Salome and Elijah on the left and right. You can't really see them well. But he also thought that religious symbols could be used as symbols of the self as well. And here we have a mandala, and Christ the Pantocrator, the all-powerful, the ruler, and we have the figures around him, so the kinds of corners of the mandala. Now, I'm inserting a little bit of my own theology here. I don't think it is contradictory to Jung, but I'm thinking about this idea of the self and the divine in the human being. One of the challenges I have had over time, and it's particularly difficult as an ordained person, is to use the kind of anthropomorphic language that we often use for God. God is often he, right? A God who is a big guy in the sky. God does this, God does that. But at some point, if we really take modern cosmology seriously, we realize that this is not something that it cannot capture the immensity of whatever it is that has set this whole cosmos in motion and that lives in you and in me. And so over time, there has been a movement to move beyond some of these traditional images of theism to the personal God. Paul Tillich, who was actually a mentor of Anne Muhlenhoff's, who taught at Union Seminary in New York, spoke of the God above God, which refers to the ground of all being, which is a reality that transcends traditional concepts of God as a being among beings. This idea is the source of absolute faith and the courage to be, as it is not limited to a being, but the very power of existence itself, which remains even when our understanding of the traditional God collapses. The courage to be is rooted in the God who appears when God has disappeared in the anxiety of doubt. It's quite a statement. In fact, it's not entirely new. Mystics throughout the ages have believed that God, the divine, is an immense mystery beyond comprehension, but a mystery that we're all living in like fish in the sea. So it is both immanent and transcendent. It's here in time, but it's also bigger than anything we can comprehend. For my own theology, this is an image that I love. This is from the Rig Vedas. It's Indra's net. And Indra casts a net out into the universe. And in the corner of each of the ropes, as it were, the strings of the net, is a jewel. And that jewel reflects all the other jewels in this infinite, sort of a rippling fabric of reflection. And I think it's a wonderful image. And it's actually apropos, because what do we spend half of our time on at computers or smartphones? On the internet, right? Or the web. So it's an image of extension and connection. And of course, we know that this is where we come from, right? Some 13 more billion years ago, whatever this thing was, that this huge conflagration of energy with what we call the Big Bang, and that you and I are literally the cooling of that energy, right, over, countless years. We are the solidification of something that began as this intense energy. It could be seen as Genesis, right? Let there be light. The fire, the energy, the mystics often talk about in many faith traditions. So I just wanted to put that in there because I don't think Jung would argue with that, but it's a way we sometimes need to reclaim images of the divine so that they become exciting and they become relevant to us. What the theologian Karl Rahner said, he called it holy mystery. He thought sometimes we used God talk too freely, but that God, whatever God is holy mystery, and you and I are embedded in this together. Now, Jung in 1944 had a series of heart attacks, and he was laid low for quite some time. And in this time of convalescence, he had near-death experiences, the kind of out-of-body experiences. You might have had, somebody you know might have had them. I remember working as a hospital orderly when I was a teenager, and the 3 to 11 shift is when the patients all kind of let down, right? They've had to be up for their friends, their families, and finally they just get to relax. And this one particular gentleman was very agitated, and he said to me, I need to tell this to someone, but you have to promise you will tell this to nobody. And he was quite agitated, and I decided, well, I'll do it. You know, I was the low man on the totem pole. He needed to get this off his chest, and it was what you might expect. He had essentially died on the table. They put out the paddles on him to resuscitate him. He saw his body from above. He saw them working on him, and then began to feel this familiar dynamic of moving in and out. Was he going to move beyond? And it was a pleasurable experience. But he could literally feel himself back and forth as the paddles were stimulating his heart. And it concerned him. He had never read any near-death experience literature. So I've had this experience. People that I know and trust well have had this kind of experience of moving into a dimension which allows you a kind of sight and awareness that's not the typical realistic perception. And so this is what Jung saw, and I had the earth back there just to say, now we know with space travel and space exploration, we can actually see this whole thing, right, from a distance. Not so much for Jung. There were some partial photographs of the earth when he was alive, but what he saw in his vision was that he seemed to be high up in space, and he saw the globe of the earth bathed in a glorious blue light. He said, I saw the deep blue sea and the continents. I knew that I was on the point of departing from the earth. The sight of the earth from this height was the most glorious thing I had ever seen. I had the feeling that everything was being sloughed away. Everything I aimed at or wished for or thought, the whole phantasmagoria of earthly existence, fell away or was stripped from me, an extremely painful process. Nevertheless, something remained. It was as if I now carried along with me everything I had ever experienced or done, everything that had happened around me. It was with me, and I was with it. I consisted of my own history, and I felt with great certainty, this is what I am. I am this bundle of what has been and what has been accomplished. So let's hear from Jung himself. This was an interview done 3 years before he died at 85 with John Freeman on a show at BBC called Face to Face.
You have written one time and another some sentences which have surprised me a little about death. Now, in particular, I remember you said that death is psychologically just as important as birth. And like it's an integral part of life, but surely it can't be like birth if it's an end, can it?
Yes, if it's an end. And there we are not quite certain about this end. Because, you know, there are these peculiar faculties of the psyche that it isn't entirely confined to space and time. You can have dreams or visions of the future. You can see round corners and such things. Only ignorance deny these facts. It's quite evident that they do exist and have existed always. Now these facts show that the psyche, in part at least, is not dependent upon these confinements. And then what? When the psyche is not under that obligation to live in time and space alone, and obviously it doesn't, then to that extent, psyche is not submitted to those laws. And that means a practical continuation of life, of a sort of psychical existence beyond time and space.
Do you yourself believe that death is probably the end, or do you believe that?
Well, I can't say. You see, the word belief is a difficult thing for me. I don't believe. I must have a reason for a certain hypothesis. Either I know a thing, and when I know it, I don't need to believe it. If I don't allow myself, for instance, to believe a thing just for the sake of believing it. I can't believe it. But when there are sufficient reasons for a certain hypothesis, I shall accept these reasons naturally. I shall say we have to reckon with the possibility of so and so. No.
Well, now you've told us that we should regard death as being a goal,
Yes.
and that to shrink away from it is to evade life and
Yes.
life purposes.
Yes.
What advice would you give to people in their later life to enable them to do this, when most of them must in fact believe that death is the end of everything?
Well, you see, I have treated many old people. And it's quite interesting to watch what the occult is doing with the fact that it is apparently threatened with a complete end. It disregards it. Life behaves as if it were going on. And so I think it is better for old people to live on, to look forward to the next day, as if he had to spend centuries. And then he lives properly. But when he is afraid, when he doesn't look forward, he looks back, he petrifies, he gets stiff and he dies before his time. But when he is living on, looking forward to the great adventure that is ahead, then he lives. And that is about what the unconscious is intending to do. Of course, it's quite obvious that we are all going to die, and this is the sad finale of everything. But nevertheless, there is something in us that doesn't believe it, apparently. But this is merely a fact, a psychological fact. Doesn't mean to me that it proves something. It is simply so. For instance, I may not know why we need salt, but we prefer to eat salt too.
So, leaving you with an image there of the immensity. So shall we open it up for
There we go.
Do you want me to work this side, Susie?
Yeah, here. See if this is on. Okay.
Just over
Right over here.
I'm sitting here grinning because I studied Jungian psychology in my 40s, and I went to Pacifica Graduate School in Santa Barbara. And this is the first time I've seen a video of Jung.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
my.
And it's just, it's a thrill.
Yeah, that's true, I agree.
That's right. He didn't give a lot of interviews. He really resisted doing this one. But we do get little glimpses here and there of him speaking.
It's just so affirming.
Yes. Mhm.
Anybody over here?
Oh, there.
Jean?
No, no.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Jim Cochran has something to say.
Yeah.
Your performance suggests that this near death or in and out experience is actually happening all the time. It can't be otherwise from what you've been saying.
Mhm.
It's happening now.
Mhm. Mhm.
At the point of death, you're going to be more aware of it.
Right, that's right.
Well, I just found myself laughing at the end of what he had to say. Even if you think you're dying, you just gotta look ahead at the next thing. Just keep going, and then you'll keep going, and then you'll keep going, and then you won't. You know, it's just like, don't quit, you know? And I think that's kind of what we're all about here at Cathedral Village. It just made me giggle. I thought it was a wonderful thing to say, because you can kind of get yourself into a loop of thinking,
Mhm.
you know, not much time left, but if you just think the other way, it goes on.
I think one of the reasons I've been drawn back to Jung is my own fear of death.
Yeah, me too.
Right. I mean, I'm sure we're not the only two in the room, right, who feel this. You're aware of time, the brevity of life. But his wonderful comment about being dead before your time, I really thought that was very helpful to me, because I tend to go down the road, and we don't know what the road will be. Yeah.
Eva.
I'm just so curious about how he misuses the word unconscious. Because if it's unconscious, you don't know anything about it. And he creates a whole world in this unknowable area. Why didn't he use something like your dream world, or, you know, but why use something that means something different to create a whole world?
Mhm.
You know, unconscious,
It's truly unconscious.
That's what the word means.
Right. But I mean, part of what he did in this book, and he also does in what he called active imagination, which was to dialogue with dream figures, is that he engaged something in a deliberate way, and he felt that something was coming from the unconscious, so that it became conscious, right? But I mean, you're right. I mean, it is literally, if you think it's unconscious, it's unconscious. So maybe part of what he is saying, he's making the unconscious conscious, right? But yeah, that's right. If it literally is unconscious, it's just exactly that. It's a good point, yeah.
Philip, I had the possibly synchronous experience of listening to an NPR show the other day. I think it was called The Pulse. And it was a story about the extraordinary suicide rate among veterans, especially the guys who are now in their 40s, who have seen terrible things. And there's been a surge of them experiencing psychedelics to break through some of this incredible, abiding pressure of war memories, a sense of depression, whatever. And this was interesting to me because I'm an atheist, and what I felt today was how close my decision to be an atheist is to exactly what you're talking about here.
Right.
Where did we come from? Where do we go? Stardust. That's that's my brief explanation. You don't believe in God, I believe in stardust. And what I was wondering as you were talking about this is that if the unconscious is in fact a set of biochemical things in this extraordinary organ we have here, how does that relate? If Jung knew about psychedelics, maybe he did, because there's some psychedelic quality to what he's talking about here. How would he connect the extraordinary cure rate? That's a very bad expression because it's not a cure. It's an intermediary resolution. And so many of these 40-year-old men experiencing a psychedelic hell of the sort that Jung seems to have experienced, brought on by himself without the benefit, I presume, of psychedelics.
That's right.
So I wonder if you have anything to say about this sort of weird connection.
Well, he didn't do drugs, particularly mescaline. He was aware of this. And, I mean, he did a lot of exploration of Native American culture. He traveled twice to the United States, traveled all over. But he was intrigued with that, peyote, mescaline. He didn't do it, but he did believe that it's possible for a drug to help open up this sense of wider consciousness. He did. But I wanted to go back to another point you made before that, which had to do with being an atheist. And at this point, I would say I've never met an atheist whose God they don't believe in is also the God I don't believe in.
Well, exactly, that's exactly
Right.
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 Yes.
Right,
So it feels to me like there's a funny kind of fine line in there
right.
between you and me.
Phillip,
There's a question over here.
well, as a young student in sociology, we were taught that religion is the way of facing the unknown. Is that a way of avoiding all of this stream of consciousness and our method for dealing with death?
Mhm. Freud thought so, that religion was infantile and it was an attempt to avoid the harsh reality of our own finite existence and also looking to some great parent in the sky to try to relieve us from our own suffering. I think Jung would have also appreciated the defensive use of religion. In other words, religion can be used defensively to avoid facing the harsh reality of life. It's also true that psychology can become sometimes so concretized that it doesn't keep some sort of openness for mystery. So I think they both can provide a kind of a useful mutual criticism of each other.
Phillip, who were the critics of Jung, and what did they say? What should we remember?
Well, certainly some psychoanalysts. I think I might have mentioned last week, I did actually, Donald Winnicott, who was a very well-known child psychoanalyst. He had been a pediatrician. And he said point blank, he thought Jung was psychotic and that all of this stuff you see was just craziness. And there were other people in the analytic field that thought he was psychotic. I mean, he was a controversial figure, and there's a reason why his family kept this book locked up in a vault and only under great pressure in some ways did they decide to release it for the facsimile publication in 2009, which you'll see there. You'll also see over there a mandala from Bhutan that we have on our wall. It's a lovely mandala because it leads you into the center, and it's hard to know sometimes whether you're coming or going. And around the perimeter looks to me kind of like atoms. It looks like they're dancing in space. So anyway, I commend that to you, as well as flipping through the book if you'd like. And then of course the text for the Red Book was published later, so you get all of the text, which is pretty dense. And sometimes I tired of reading it, but I made it all the way through. There are good parts, and then you can imagine he's going on and on and on with these dialogues with these figures and arguing big questions about whether God contained both evil and good. He was very affected from his traditional Christian background, but he always had this fascination with the spiritual. And as I read more and more of him too, I'm struck by the fact that I think he was essentially a parapsychologist. He had done research, in consciousness and word association, but he was raised in a family that did seances. His own research, his doctoral research, had to do with this line of seance and was it schizophrenic illusion or not? And of course, you see him in later life being fascinated by things beyond space and time. I know, Rick, last week you talked about Henry James, and that Henry has some idea of a kind of a central.
William James. Yeah.
William James, I always get them confused. Right, a sort of a higher self, right?
Yeah.
So apparently Jung and James did meet twice, and they discussed parapsychology. That was their interest. Yeah.
Phillip, what did his dreams portend with World War II? Wasn't there some issue with him addressing the Aryan with a capital A, A-R-Y,
Mm-hmm.
And what did he say about that? About his support for what was going on with Hitler?
Right. Well, backing up, first of all, it was the First World War where he began to first have these premonitions and saw visions of the northern European geography covered with blood, inundated. And these pursued him for weeks at a time, and he felt like he was going crazy. And it was actually that area of precognition that began to get him more opened up, as it were, to the fantasies of the Red Book. World War II, he was the head of a psychoanalytic organization that had German analysts as well as Jewish analysts. He didn't espouse any anti-Semitism, but I think passively he was part of an organization that, obviously had the presence of Nazis. He was actually, and I have to research this more, I think it's true that he was actually, somebody wanted him to see if he could do some psychoanalysis with Nazis. He declined that, meaning that he was going to try to understand how such evil could exist. And in another part of this interview, and I commend it to you on YouTube, he talks about the reality of evil and how the shadow has such power in a political situation. So we can't say that he was he complicit? He might have been. I mean, there have been many, ideas that he was anti-Semitic. He did help many Jewish colleagues. He was Freud's, great heir apparent, and Freud liked the idea that he was a Christian, a Gentile, because psychoanalysis was so identified with Jews, who, as we know, I mean, Freud was late in leaving Vienna for England, very late, in a state of denial, I think, about the Nazis. So he almost didn't make it out.
You better come back and talk more about all of that.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've come to the time when we need to call it quits, and people maybe to stay and ask you questions if they have other questions, but thank you so much for.
Thank you. Thank you.